Hello, and we are live. And I apologize to Jamie. Jamie, yeah, I am late. I apologize. Um, I'm just trying to see comments. I can't even see comments. There they are. Yeah. Yes, I have got the show on the road. Finally. It's difficult. I've got it's not that late. It is late in the UK. It is like 1 o'clock, but when you've got a dog which won't go to sleep, makes a lot of noise. 17-year-old who wants to come down and see what I'm doing. I'm like, no, just it's a pain in the ass. So yeah, I've got this. It finally got going. So it's going to be a shortened stream. It was going to be probably like a 90-minute, 2-hour stream, but I am aware, Jamie, you've got a stream going at 2, and so's Corey. So a bit of competition there. Um, what's going on? You're in competition with each other. I think I'll just do my hour thing and then let you two battle it out. But yeah, this was. I just wanted to. I've been doing 3 weeks on the run. I've done like a tier ranking, and it's just getting a bit repetitive. And where do I go with it? Naughties. I'm not versed enough in horror films from 2000, 2010. I've seen a lot of them, but it's funny. It's like the more recent you see a film, the less you remember about it. If you think about like films from the 90s and the 80s, you remember every little detail, and you've seen them a lot more probably as well. But yeah, so I didn't think a tier ranking for the noughties would. I don't think it'd work, and it's definitely not for like the next decade, because 2010 to 2019, I would really need to like sort of go and really just go back and dig deep into it. Of what I remember of the last 10 years in horror, It Follows and The Final Girls and not much else. Scream 4 maybe, and that's only because it's a Scream film. But yeah, it's one of those things. It's the older you get, the more the older stuff resonates, and you can remember every little detail. And I guess I can't do that with the newer stuff, so I will have to really go back and dig deep. And I think that's why the stream tonight is why I went for what I did. It's more of like an 80s, 90s thing. But I did want to go into it like what I've watched recently. I've gone to IMDb, which is you know The Empty Man. It's it deserves the hype. I think I gave it a 7. It is definitely. It's slightly getting a bit too much. I agree that it is a good film, but I do think that people maybe are like sort of, because it's a long film and because it doesn't follow the usual tropes of your traditional sort of like horror film, and that title does make it appear to be like something like The Gallows or The Slender Man, and it's not like that at all. It's a very the cast is not a bunch of kids. It's a middle-aged man, and to a lesser extent a middle-aged woman, but it, it is a good film, but it shouldn't be. Maybe I do think maybe there's a slight case of it being overrated by certain, by people, because it's not just your generic 90-minute slasher film or psychological horror film, but it is a good film. It's definitely a good film. Breakdown, which I watched recently, I've seen it before back in the day. This is such a solid film. It really is. It's an example of. It's such a simple premise. This sort of film, take characters from out of town, from this. These are always in the city. They go to like the sticks, wherever it is, and they're basically made to pay the price. And Kurt Russell turns up with his wife. They've got a Massachusetts registration plate, which is a warning signal for them that they've got money. he's got his chinos on, his Ralph Lauren shirt, and he stands out like a sore thumb. And when you've got characters like you were called Red, that gives you an example of like the sort of people you're dealing with. These are sort of like I won't say backwards. I don't want to be derogatory, but these are the rednecks, and these people are the white middle class, and they pay the price for being who they are. And it's a really solid film. I'd forgotten how good it was. It's got a bit of it's a more humane version of The Hitcher. It's more believable. But it's a very similar sort of premise. Um, Going on and Revenge of the Nerds, which I saw recently, which I haven't seen for a long time. My God, this film it's very dated. It's not a great film. It's really not. It's kind of like a less offensive version of Porky's, but it's set in the 80s, so it's not set in the past. So as it's obviously in the past now, but it's not a very funny film, and it's like one of those 80s comedies which has not aged well at all. I mean, I look at Police Academy, I think that has aged really well, but I look at like films like Stripes, which has got Bill Murray in, and look at films like this, and I just don't think they've aged at all. It's one of those when you come back as an adult, and this is going back to I'll go back to this staying on topic of being an 80s 90s kid and watching films of that era. It is quite a shock sometimes when you go back and watch some of these films, but not an 80s 90s film. Something very recent, Godzilla King of Monsters, 2019. This is awful, awful film. This is. I've not seen Godzilla Kong. I wanted to watch this first because I'd seen Godzilla from 2014. Great film. Really, really good film. Solid film. Kong Skull Island. It's not bad. It's a 6 out of 10. It's not great. This is just absolute garbage. Awful. Terrible film. Really, really. I mean, the acting. Donald Pleasance. God, why I've got Halloween on the brain. Charles Dance. You know, a quality actor, and you've got him as a bit part character in a film where he's not even really the villain. Like, and Vera Farmiga, I struggle with that name. She is kind of like meant to be a villain. Well, she's not really a villain. Her morals are, twisted slightly, but yeah, the two best actors in this film are kind of like brushed off to the side for Millie Bobby Brown and her dad, who just, and they're not. I mean, Millie Bobby Brown is not. I'm not sorry. She's not a good actor. I don't care what anyone says. She's not. She's she's living off Stranger Things, and she wasn't good in Stranger Things. And the dad in it, no, it's a terrible film. And finally, I won't go into any more of my films because, yeah, shoplifters of the world. This is horrendous. 4 out of 10 from me on IMDb. This is anyone who's a Smiths fan, which I am. This is set in 1987 in Denver. They just found out that Smiths were split up, and a bunch of whiny little. They act like millennials. They're meant to be Gen Xers. They act like millennials. They whine. They it's the funny thing about this film is it's like the three male characters in this film I thought were gay, and apparently only one of them is, but I thought all three of them were gay, and not wrong with that. I was assuming that they were all gay, and when two of them apparently aren't, I'm like, oh, I thought they were. It just didn't make much sense in the film, but it's basically an excuse to play a load of Smith songs, which is a good thing because the Smiths are one of the greatest bands of all time. But yeah, it's a really, really, really bad film. Terrible film. So that's enough for that. Back. Oh, sources in the chat. What's up, Steak Sauce? You know what? I'm gonna leave a link because I'd like someone to jump on if possible. If that So there's the link. If anyone wants to jump on, they can do. I am going to talk about 80s, 90s, retro culture. Growing up in the 80s, going from the 90s. I know Source is probably a little bit young for that, but who gives a shit? It's just something that really resonates with me. Getting older now, 44, going on 45, it's just a little bit it's getting a bit annoying the way things are going. Sylvester Stallone's just been cancelled for joining a golf club because it's owned by Donald Trump, and I'm like, seriously, is this where we're going? It's like, nah. So I thought, you know what, do a stream, going back to the 80s, going back to the 90s, and have a little chat about that. So really, and I did make a little bit of a list about what I wanted to do about, this time and why it was so special. I had to make a little list because there's so much. Now, starting off with cartoons from the 80s, the 90s, can't be topped. Now, I'm not a big expert on what's going on now on the Disney Channel, shit like that. But in the 80s, we had Thundercats, we had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Although after that in the UK it was called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. We had the Raccoons. Man, the Raccoons had the greatest theme tune of all time. Anybody who's never seen the Raccoons, I think it's Canadian. Just watch the end credits. The theme tune is just amazing. Jamie Fackley, yes, Jamie Fackley. Yeah, I did go off. I was late, but it's good to see you back. We're just talking 90s, 80s cartoons. So give me your suggestions. If you want to join the stream, just join. Just hop on. It'd be nice to see someone else. Talk about 80s cartoons, and obviously you are a Gen Xer like me, and I have picked American cartoons because the UK, we were just bombarded with American cartoons throughout the 80s and the 90s, and as I say, Thundercats, He-Man, do you remember the Raccoons, Jamie? Because I have just amazing memories of that. And Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which was called the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles when I grew up, because it was classed as too violent. Ninjas wasn't allowed. Ninjas was considered nunchucks and people getting killed, so we had to call it Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, which just shows how naff things are in the UK. But the 80s and the 90s was just a totally different time. It didn't feel like politics played a part in anything you watched. When you watch anything now, it always feels like there's an agenda. It feels like there's something going on behind the scenes to make you think, in a certain way. And then, back in the 80s, it's just, something was made and it's like, okay, yeah, sign that off. We'll put that on. Okay, James, that's fine. I understand you got a stream at there too. So, or nothing. You don't remember the Raccoons? Google the Raccoons. If you don't know, Google the Raccoons.
This came back from a search.
Oh my god! Sorry, my phone is just going crazy. Google the Raccoons, because I may not remember that, because that is like your era. It's definitely my era, because I was probably about 10 when that was like a big thing in the UK. So you would have been a little bit older than me. So I'm sure you remember Thundercats though. You also remember Thundercats. But anyway, yeah, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, as it was called in the UK. That was something that I don't think people can properly. They can't get their head around how big that was when, well, I was that age. I think people nowadays, they, they live a life of social media and they think something's big or something's trending, but it's trending in a very small circle because it's only really reaching a group on Facebook or a group on Instagram or a group on Twitter. When too old, maybe you're not that old, Jamie. No, but you're definitely too old for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles then. Yeah, so in terms of in terms of things being big back in the 80s, I don't think people of this generation, this like sort of Gen Z, millennials, older millennials, was about younger millennials because they're closer to my age, but when something was big, it was big. It was huge. I mean, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was massive deal, massive deal. I mean, when it was massive deal in the UK, I can only imagine what it was like in the US. The film dropped in, I think, 1990. We got the cartoon in 89, 88. And we were just, yeah, we were sold on it. In where I'm from, we were sold on it. We were huge Ninja Turtles fans, massive Ninja Turtles fans, and it's one of those. The film did not detract from the cartoon. The only difference was really for us watching it as for you in the US is Raphael was like the leader in the film rather than Leonardo. But we didn't really have a problem with that. It's just good that they they didn't try to put across any sort of message with the movie. This was a simpler time, and it's just a really great thing about the 80s. And I suppose with I'm thinking with the Thundercats cartoon, Care Bears. I remember Care Bears. Snorks? No, I don't remember the Snorks. Maybe that never made it over to the UK. But in terms of apparently they are remaking Thundercats, and Thundercats was always like a very sort of macho, ultra masculine sort of cartoon. You had Lion-O, Panthro, you had Chitara, obviously was the feminine female character, but I mean, I only imagine what they're going to do if they make a film. They're probably going to change it in some way where it's just woke in some way. And what's the point? Who's this appealing to? If you're gonna make a Thundercats movie, make it appeal to young boys and girls if they want, and make it appeal to the boys' dads who could take the boys to watch it. Don't try and turn it to some, you know, nonsense for just, a bit of empowerment and racism and stuff. It's just make it what it is. And talking about 80s cartoons, we're moving on now to one date, Jamie. If you don't remember Dungeons and Dragons, I'm going to unsubscribe from your YouTube channel if you don't remember Dungeons and Dragons, because Dungeons and Dragons is the greatest cartoon of the 1980s, without doubt. Just just such a good cartoon. And it's all the tropes of like a fantasy. You've got ranger, you've got a barbarian, you've got everything. It's just it does follow all those tropes. You've got like a little dungeon master, but it's it's something that always cried out for a film as well. And to my estimation, never got a film. I know Dungeons and Dragons, there was a Dungeons and Dragons movie, but it was never based on the cartoon. It was just a generic. Oh, I mean, it was awful. Jeremy Irons was in it, and Jeremy Irons is a fantastic actor, but he was just dialing that role in. And, you know, that franchise deserved something more because Dungeons and Dragons is getting a massive renaissance at the minute as well. So there's since lockdown, millions of people are playing. Well, millions more, thousands more are playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it definitely deserves. It deserves something new, and apparently it is getting a new film, but I don't know what it's based on. I don't know if it's based what world it's based on. I mean, personally, I'd like to see it based on the Forgotten Realms, which is one of the Dungeons and Dragons worlds. But they might just base it on some generic world. I don't know. It's with Hollywood now. I don't know what they're going to do. But pretty much, I could talk about cartoons all night, but I am wary of the fact that time is marching on, and I don't want to obviously moving on because I know Jamie and Corey are live streaming in like 60 minutes and it's like 40 minutes, so I'm just going to try and move things on and talk about 80s and 90s films and why they are so much not better. That's the wrong word to use. They're not. They're just, as I say, it's a more innocent time, and growing up in the 70s, well, growing up in the 80s and into the early 90s as a someone who's going on 13 and then going on 18 in the late 90s, it was just a good time to be into action films and to just have an action film with an action star who wasn't trying to be something he's not. Look at Bruce Willis in Die Hard, look at Arnie in Predator, look at Sly in Rambo. It's just guys with big muscles, being men, and if that makes me a toxic white male for liking that, well, I'm a toxic white male because that is what we like growing up. That's what that's what we enjoyed, and it's become an issue now where they're trying to make it like it's trying to make it like it's a bad thing, and it's not. It's just the way things were then. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's nothing wrong with men being men and women being women. People say, "Oh, there's no, female representation." We had that in spades in the 80s, and people always refer to, "Oh, it's Ripley in Aliens," or it's Sarah Connor in Terminator. Obviously the obvious, but you had Cynthia Rothrock, China O'Brien. You had there were female martial artists. That's actually like me. I'm not. I'm not, Jamie. I'm not. I'm really not. I think you're on the same. You're on board with me with this one. You like your 80s movies with your action men and your action women. Look at, as I say, look at Red Sonja. Red Sonja with Arnie. You've also got was it Tanya Roberts? Badass with a sword. Bridget Nielsen. She was a badass. Grace Jones in View to a Kill. Tough women. It wasn't just. It was a thing about the 80s. Women were tough, men were tough. It wasn't a thing that it was like toxic masculinity. It was just like everyone was tough in the 80s, either genre. It's just when we got to like the sort of 2000s, 2010s that they decided, oh, you can't have that. Anyway, moving on. I'll talk about films now. What was I was going to? Oh yeah, video games. Video games. Now, yeah, violence and gore is violence and gore. It is. Now, this is a controversial one because video games in the 90s and 80s, obviously, when you talk about movies and if you talk about any sort of anything related to pop culture and obviously books, movies, TV, obviously something from 2010s, 2020s compared to the 80s, it's either not as good or it's on the same level or it's slightly better. When you talk about video games, you have to admit that obviously it's better. You can't deny it. It's technology is so advanced now that video games have improved to the point, where you can't really compare them, but you can still appreciate an art form for what it is back in the day. And with video games, yes, they have moved on, but I'm old school, and there are certain genres of video game where you no matter how much you upgrade them, there's still more fun, going back to the when you were playing them in the 80s and 90s. And a case in point would be, something like Tetris. I'll take a simple one, Tetris. Tetris on the Game Boy. You can do what you want with that game. It's never going to get better than handheld game in your pocket, which is just, four types of blocks coming down. It's never going to get any. How can you improve on it? You can't. You can put in some like sort of fancy graphics, but it's not going to change anything. The addictiveness of that game is still that basic concept of, four blocks falling down in different shapes, and you just maneuver them. But even going into more advanced sort of genres of video game like beat 'em ups, I still say that for me, you have one-on-one beat 'em ups now, like Street Fighter, the latest incarnation of Street Fighter. It's not that much different from Street Fighter 2 in 1992 or 1991, whenever it came out. It's a variant of it, but it's not that much different. A beat 'em up is a beat 'em up. Obviously, role-playing games have got way more in depth. If you look at a game which, look at Elder Scrolls, like the original Elder Scrolls, or even Oblivion, big world, you can go a lot of places. But if you look at the way they've built on that now, and especially what they'll do with the new one, it's going to be a massive jump. But if you look at like Street Fighter 2 from 1991 to what Street Fighter is now, it's not a massive jump, and because essentially it's just one-on-one, with a backdrop, and you're, beating the shit out of each other. You can't really, and why would you want to improve on that? And your Jamie's notifications just popped up on my laptop, so at least I'm subscribed. But you can't really improve. You can improve, but you can't do that much with a one-on-one beat 'em up, and that's the glory of Street Fighter 2. And certainly back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a kid, going to school in 89, 90, 91. And where I went to school, we had a VHS rental store, not my local VHS rental store, but one where I went to school, and they had the arcade version of Final Fight. This must have been 91, I think. 91. I must have been whatever. I think that came out in 91, I think. But the money I put in that machine, because obviously in those machines back in the day, if you died, put more money in, you just carry on. So you could essentially you could complete the game as long as you put enough money in. They weren't soft, but I only ever got as far. I got so far and thought I'm not going to put any more money in. I'm just going to try and do it on ability, which never worked. But yeah, they were golden times, and just amusement arcades back in the day. I mean, I had to go into the centre of Liverpool for an actual proper amusement arcade. There was, we didn't have them. Amusement arcades in England were not in like suburbs. They were like in city centres, or they were in like seaside towns. So for me to go to an amusement arcade would have been, I used to go and get a bus, go into the city centre, and in the late 80s, it would be just fruit machines. I think, do you call it fruit machines in America? I'm not sure. Basically, what you get in Vegas, the one-armed bandits, they would take up about 20% of the floor space, and 80% of the floor space would be, arcade machines. It would be, from Outrun, oh my God, Contra, Operation Wolf, all the classics. But as you got into the early 90s, you'd notice that the floor space would increasingly become more and more fruit machines, because anyone of my era will know that as you got towards the mid 90s, the power of home consoles was starting to overtake that of arcade machines. So arcade machines became more or less irrelevant in the space of 3 or 4 years. So what used to be an arcade, an arcade, amusement arcade, it just became basically something for like fruit machines, and you'd be left with like these ginormous sorts of machines that you couldn't replicate at home. Like there'd be like a ginormous Star Wars game, or some massive racing game with like 8 people combined. But just a normal, like Pac-Man, which would have been a staple of an arcade in the mid '80s. They were long gone, and even the more advanced games that came along, they were going as well, because the PlayStation One the PlayStation One. I think maybe the Neo Geo coming from Japan, they were producing games that if the arcades couldn't compete with, or were just about competing with, then why would you go to an arcade and pay, £1 to play for what accounts to 2 minutes, when you could just spend, £200 on a console and buy a game for the same level. So that was really sort of the downturn of, um, video games in terms of amusement arcades. From the mid 90s, it was just it ended, and that's another part of being a Gen Xer, which was the title of this video, which I'm finally going to get to. Is well, I had to get to earlier on, but basically, you know, being somebody from Gen X as opposed to someone who's a millennial, not really a millennial, maybe a younger millennial, because I think older millennials are on the same wavelength as people like me and Jamie, and people like Lorne and Jay, people in our community. We can see we can see the difference, and we can appreciate what's the good stuff that's come out of what's new, but we can really appreciate what we had. And I think that goes for any sort of generation. I mean, there'll be the people, the millennials now, people from Gen Z in the future, 20 years from now, they will say, oh, we were so great, we had smartphones, we had social media, and we had this, that and the other. And my generation, well, maybe not everyone in my generation, but people in my generation will be saying, I was so lucky that I didn't have smartphones, I didn't have social media, because I feel blessed that I didn't have all that crap when I was growing up. Because I think that social media and I think it benefits mature adults like what I am now, but I don't think it benefits teenagers, and it certainly doesn't benefit 9 and 10-year-olds who shouldn't have a smartphone at all, in my opinion. I don't understand why any um, 9 or 10-year-old would have a cell phone or smartphone, mobile phone. That just to me is just crazy. But yeah, I suppose that is the thing about a lot of people from Generation X, is we do have that feeling that we we do sort of straddle kind of two different eras in a way, in that being born in 1976, I was 17 in 94. So although the internet didn't really become a thing, well, I didn't get the internet until 2002, but I suppose when the internet started making major waves across the world, that was kind of more towards the late 90s, and I was still young. I was still like a young man. I was like in my early 20s. So I kind of straddled two different, eras in terms of I really appreciate the old school, you know, VHS era. But at the same time, when DVDs came out, I was still, young enough to really get into it. And like it was 2021, 22. And so when that became a thing, I was like fully on board. But I kind of felt a little bit of guilt towards the past. It's like, oh, this is later, not at the time, but later on, because you do sort of feel a bit of sort of, well, this was the sort of the end, the beginning of the end. We didn't know it at the time, but I think I was going to do a separate video, but I might as well just do it in this live stream. Is growing up at my time and being a young adult in the late 90s, Scream the film Scream, it kind of really emphasizes the culmination of the old with the new. And what I mean by that is, as being someone who was 20 when that film came out, you have this sort of amalgamation of different ideas. You've got like the old school with the scene with Randy explaining the rules. I think he's explaining that he may not have been explaining the rules of the horror genre in the video store, but there's a scene in the video store where Randy is talking to Sydney, I think, and maybe Billy, but they're in the video store, and I'm pretty sure it's primarily it must have been VHS because it was 96, probably when they were filming it must have been 95. So we're talking like, 96 era, and this is just before the birth of DVDs. And it's like, it's interesting because I can't imagine, does Billy, no, so, sorry, if his name escapes me, why have I forgotten his name? Anyway, Scream, what the hell? Why? What's the nerd's name? Why have I forgotten his name? I just said his name. Anyway, he's talking about, the rules. Is he aware that Randy, God, Randy, sorry, Randy, is he, also interested me, is he aware at that time, I know it's only a film, but the era that he loves is coming to an end because it's just a year or two off. And as we move from VHS to DVD moves to online streaming. And that's the thing about this era is not only do we move from VHS to DVD, we move into the internet era in the late 90s, and in the early noughties we move into it big time. And so the DVD era in terms of rental is very short-lived, and it moves towards online rental. So it's kind of the film. It covers. If you've watched that film, the use of the mobile phone when they're taunting, the victims, that is something that it came along at the perfect time. 5 years previous, there wouldn't have been a cell phone. Well, not of a reasonable size to use. 5 years later, that would have been seen as old hat. So at that time, the use of a cell phone in a movie, a horror movie, was like a new prop, and they used it to perfection. And yeah, and I guess the idea that at that time it's like VHS store that will soon change. The idea of just going to a physical media store to rent out a film would be changed within 5 or 6 years after that. Scream is like a perfect time capsule. It's a perfect time capsule for somebody who is from Generation X and an older millennial, because it would be lost on a younger person. They wouldn't understand the impact of that film and certain elements within that film. But I think I've waffled on enough about Scream. Now it is, so we've got 15 minutes till Jamie starts streaming, and we've got 15 minutes till Corey starts streaming. So I'll just wrap things up now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to screen share, if I can do this, because I've set it up already. So this is quite a bit of a, I hope Lorne eventually watches this stream, because it'll be of some interest to Lorne. If I share screen. So these are buildings of some importance to me as a kid. Well, one of them is, well, two of them are. And the first one is this building. And I'll share it now. So this is, it's now called the Five Ways Centre. It's a health centre. But on the other side, just on the back of it, is Chilwell Library. Now, Chilwell Library, which used to be encompass this whole building, they knocked it down completely and built this on top. But this whole building used to just be a library, and this is where I spent all my time. You know, Friday night, every Friday night, I would go to this. What used to be this building was not there anymore, and rent books out. He's obsessed with supernatural books about UFOs and stuff. But more interestingly, before the building that this is built on, the building before that was a building that one of Lorne's favourite authors, Ramsey, who we interviewed a few weeks ago, used to go as a child. Because I commented on the interview Lorne did with him, and I had no idea, and he said, "Yeah, this plot of land is where Ramsey used to go to get books as a kid." And although I'm not a massive, I don't know much about Ramsey, but Lorne assures us that he is one of the most important horror writers of the 20th century, and who am I to disagree? But in terms of talk about horror writers, where this building is, if you to scroll left, if you to go where this road is, go this road 100 yards, and you come to this building, King David High School, here. This, although this has since been rebuilt, obviously it was another building which was knocked down and rebuilt, but this is the school where Clive Barker went as a child. So Clive Barker went to school within a couple of 100 yards of where Ramsey went to read books as a kid, which is just crazy. And to finish off, this is a Indian takeaway, just literally next to where I've just pointed out about the school and library. This is just on the other side of the road. This is all where close proximity to where I grew up. This used to be where I spent my entire childhood, Saturdays, Sundays, and just like Friday nights. This used to be the Five Ways Video Centre. So the door used to be in the middle. We'd walk in. Centre aisle would be new releases, and this was back in the late 80s. So a new release would consist of something like Die Hard, or something like Tango and Cash or something. And there'd be an aisle either side. Aisle to the left would be all your horror. So we'd always venture into the left aisle. Horror films, you name it. Just films that I didn't see until years later. From Beyond, a Lovecraft film. I didn't see that film for a long time, because it was just you'd see these covers and you'd rent out Friday the 13th or Halloween. There'd be a dozen of, be 100 of films you'd never ever see because you just never get round to them, and you'd only get round to them as an adult. And like as you where all the horror titles were, on the top shelf was all your your adult stuff. So you'd spend 10 minutes looking at the horror, and then you'd be like sort of staring up at trying to get a look at the end and trying to pull one down and have a look at the back. And then as you walked in on the right side is where you'd have all the computer games. So we'd have like Commodore 64 games. Amstrad, if anyone remembers a Commodore 64, legendary computer. We'd have Amstrad games, Spectrum 48K. Anyone in the UK knows what I'm talking about. It was just a golden time. I remember watching the whole of Silent Rage starring Chuck Norris in this shop. Just turned up one day, he put it on, and we just spent the entire day expecting 2 hours just stood there watching this film. And the staff, that was the thing. The staff in them days, Blockbuster probably would have told you to get out. In these little independent video stores, they didn't care. They just like, well, yeah, just watch it. Are you going to spend any money? No. Who cares? So yeah, it was just a great time. And back to my, and I'll just unshare that. But anyway, yeah. So that's basically. I think I'll leave it there. I've done 48 minutes. Jamie's up soon, and so is Corey. So anyone who's watching tonight, Jamie, thanks a lot. I know somebody else was in the chat. Oh, well, stay turned up for like a minute. Hopefully they'll come back and watch it. But anyway, thanks guys. Yeah, this has been a really good stream. I really enjoyed it. It's something a bit different from a tier ranking video. But anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you. See you later. Bye.